Extremism and Terrorism. I'm Ararat Kostanian, Research Fellow at USANA's Foundation, Research Fellow at Oriental Studies Institute, National Academy of Sciences of Armenia, and I'm privileged to be joined by a leading expert in the field today, and she is Dr. Jolene Jerard, an adjunct senior fellow at Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University. She received her PhD at St. Andrews in IR and was a visiting research fellow at CAPS Kabul. She has conducted, it's very interesting, field research in threat zones in different parts of the world: Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, South Philippines, South Thailand, and Middle East. Also, she co-edited several books on counter-radicalization and counter-extremism, building social resilience through community engagement. I would like to welcome Dr. Jolene Jerard. Hello, Jolene.
Hi, I trust you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you very clearly now.
Perfect.
Welcome to our panel.
Thank you very much for having me.
My first question will be, to what extent the fight against extremism and terrorism have been effective to this day on global level in general?
Ararat, I think we have a different system. Like, let her give her presentation first, and then we'll start the question and answer session.
Okay, here you go, Dr. Jerard.
That is fine. Let me just perhaps, so to save a little bit of bandwidth here. So what I will do is, let me just go through a quick presentation that sort of lends a lead up to the excellent question that actually you have posed, Dr. Kostanian. In terms of thinking about this broader efforts of community engagement, I know you've had a number of sessions speaking about the whole gamut of this whole spectrum of dealing with counterterrorism, dealing with what Dr. Malkanthi had spoken about earlier, rehabilitation, disengagement. And the third facet here includes the element of what we refer to as community engagement. Sometimes within academia, we refer to this as the process of preventing violent extremism. The terms and terminologies, as I will sort of show them today in this first quick 15-20 minutes, does overlap sometimes in the colloquial use. So whenever we see work and discussions on preventing violent extremism or countering violent extremism, often enough, as you would notice in your chats, they sometimes do overlap. So today's foundational presentation, as I would put it, that lends to the discussions that would take place today, speaks to the role of community engagement and the broader element of the fight against exclusivism, extremism, and terrorism, where we inspire at the end of the day to build a sense of resilience and resolve in working with communities against terrorism. In doing so, we recognize the fact that with global threats, there are often enough regional implications. So what does that yield to and mean to us? Certainly, security is amongst the foremost tasks of governments, as you would rightfully recognize. It is vital that states remain robust in their efforts to isolate, contain, and even mitigate or reduce security threats. Much of the presentations in this lead-up would have spoken to this. But the challenge is how we think about it. Ultimately, our attitudes will also define action moving forward, especially within the remit of community engagement. How we think about it will influence broader policy positions and simultaneously impact the manner through which we then respond to the threat. Certainly today, in efforts of community engagement, managing information in this age of insecurity, as we often call it, is a central challenge that we all collectively face. This transformation in managing information in the age of insecurity has certainly had an enormous impact on society, especially the way through which information is processed and understood. This transformative power of technology, continued radicalization, recruitment, steadfast innovation within groups, and this dense cross-pollination of ideas have resulted in evolving trends and new tradecraft and tactics within transnational terrorist groups. And in doing so, we recognize these dominant trends that have an impact on society. First and foremost, when we deal with community engagement, we recognize the paradigm in terms of the environment and the challenges in dealing with community engagement or using community engagement as a strategy. It's an important facet, but not without its challenges. The transformative power of technology has meant that certainly today with social media platforms, be it Facebook or Meta, whether you're talking about prominent platforms such as Instagram, or when you're thinking about other smaller platforms such as Discord, the role of social media platforms has enabled access and speed. But at the same time, it has ensured a sense of anonymity through encryption, and certainly that overlapping role that it plays in terms of recruitment and radicalization. The other facet in terms of the role by which, when we are thinking about these broader aspects of the current environment, impacting communities certainly would include the methods of attack and certainly the scales of attack that you would have seen historically, and certainly what communities, and in this, when I say communities here, it refers to states and government organizations, try to mitigate in terms of the efforts to mitigate, isolate, and contain the threat. Often enough, through the variety of methods of attack, you see its impact on the community, be it in terms of mass slaughter attacks or suicide attacks, or the call for lone shooters or lone wolf attacks on the ground. Today, as we think about these shifting challenges in terms of, especially of the role of technology, these attack spectrums, and the role of recruitment and radicalization, how terrorist groups try to capitalize on fundamentalist or exclusivist ideas, how they capitalize on recruitment and radicalization, drawing momentum from capitalizing on technology. We recognize that there is a cycle of adaptation in laying the foundation to understand how community engagement functions in this broader remit. These cycles of adaptation, and you would have recognized the fact that we've seen a multiplicity of these cycles of adaptation when we speak about trends of how terrorism and extremism and even exclusivism impacts the community, be it in terms of radical ideology or propaganda, this clash of identity in terms of what is impacting modernity. Let me just, I think there was, okay, can you see it now? Can you see the slide now?
Yes, Dr.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I think it went off for a moment. Okay, and in terms of understanding and trying to find order in chaos is important. But that said, while we try and make sense of identifying order in chaos, we understand that when we think about it through scholarship, we are collectively trying to, when working with the communities, there is certainly this effort to deal with and address these underlying drivers of activities and events and circumstances that are conducive to terrorism. Certainly for governments and agencies, it means a rebalancing of priorities. And it also means that today, when we think about working with the community, it involves shifting working methods that are in place sometimes and having an impact to certainly resourcing. How do we resource these efforts of community engagement? While certainly there is resource being pushed in to the effort of kill, catch, disrupt terrorist cells and organizations, or once they are arrested, putting them through a pathway or process of rehabilitation and reintegration, trying to make sense of how to resource, and what would be the benefits of having this element of working within the preventative sphere? Certainly, we see the value in working in prevention. So if you can prevent someone from even going through this path of radicalization, hopefully you can nip the issue in the bud to prevent them from even embarking on a violent extremist act, or in that process going downstream in terms of an arrest or a possible threat of attack. This age of insecurity has meant that today we always deal with a level of forecasting. While we tend to forecast against the methodology and typology of attacks, the methods and means of attack, certainly the element today that we recognize, we try and forecast, but not all forecasts hit fruition. Not all forecasts are some things that we can legitimately pinpoint to. Certainly when we are looking at these overlapping challenges, be it within the remit of the pandemic and what it means for security, it also has meant that when we think about the pandemic, it has also impacted the resourcing of community engagement programs. But while we think about resourcing being one part of a challenge, we acknowledge the fact that there are vulnerable groups, and the important facet here is in working in preventing violent extremism is to identify vulnerable groups, adapt to the techniques and evolving techniques used by the terrorist groups, be it in terms of this transformative power technology, recruitment, radicalization, or even their means through which they're going to attempt to engage with the community in order to recruit and radicalize or conduct mass-scale attacks. But it also means improving capacity building and community engagement strategies that are ahead. We acknowledge that where there are vulnerable individuals, there are vulnerable communities. And at its heart, today, as we think about these broad brushstrokes of community engagement, we recognize the need to learn from retrospection. Learning from the past is important. Best practices, as well as key failures, the presence of interdicted plots, all of which what we learn from the past as a collective. We acknowledge the importance of community engagement as a platform and as a means through which countries build resilience. Community engagement at its heart is a strategic process with the goal of engaging with groups of individuals with unique interests in this case in order to build the necessary resilience within a community. In defining community resilience, while like terrorism, there is no common or agreed upon definition sometimes as we debate through it within the remit of academia, but we underscore the fact that it is ultimately the ability of the community to withstand pressure and impact on the stressors on the communal or social fabric, especially when you think about it within the ambit of terrorism or extremism or exclusivism and how it hits at some of the most primordial elements of community and society, faith, ethnicity, the issues that sometimes drive many of these groups, especially the more religiously inspired groups for that matter. And of course, the importance of inspiring a sense of resolve. Community engagement at its heart involves a few overlapping terminologies. Certainly, we have the role of community resilience, which I shared with you earlier a little while ago in the last slide. But there is also this notion of social cohesion. It's an important facet of community resilience. Social cohesion is the ongoing process of developing a sense of well-being, a sense of belonging and voluntary participation sometimes of members of society. It ultimately refers to the development and acceptance and promotion of a multiplicity of values and culture. Strong community resilience and cohesion can serve as a deterrent towards terrorist attacks. Modern theories of deterrence have already embraced ideas of resilience, where a resilient and cohesive community understands the threat well and understands that the main thrust of what terrorism does is to divide. So while we acknowledge sound knowledge of terrorist tactics, trends, and procedures are important, there is also the need to embrace this notion of moving from a whole of government approach to a whole of society approach. And in doing so, three facets are important: the role of community involvement, the role of community engagement, and the role of community resilience. Community involvement it basically refers to individuals within the community wanting to make a sustainable change as individuals. Community engagement here involves the role of government partnership with the community or stakeholders to engage with individuals on issues that are sometimes related to terrorism, radicalization, or even beyond. And community resilience, the establishment of the goal of community resilience, where resilience is in turn defined as a process of a set of adaptive capabilities to a positive trajectory of functioning, as you would call it, and adaptation where a country is able to bounce back in the aftermath of an attack. So engagement functions in all these three arenas, be it in terms of the individual, be it in the terms of broader community, government, civil society partnerships, but with the absolute aim of trying ultimately to build a sense of resilience. Challenge is, do we need to redefine action today? Community engagement and social cohesion is work in progress. Community engagement programs present viable opportunities to build social cohesion and resilience. And in doing so, societies can choose to achieve greater levels of social cohesion by forging greater inclusivity. There are often two things that can break this: exclusivist ideas and sometimes the imposition of a perceived group superiority, be it in terms of class, race, or ethnicity. Today, as we think about this idea of countries and communities moving towards these broader ideals of reflection in terms of a sense of solidarity or togetherness as members of the community, we recognize that in working in preventing, countering violent extremism, these community engagement or prevention strategies, some of which involves reintegration patterns or rehabilitation. That's one facet of it that you would have heard in the previous session. But early intervention has meant that today the expanding role of technology, the expanding role of youth, looking at enhanced role of communities, families, different facets of the community, expanding the role of civil society organizations, centers and organizations such as this platform, for example, where everyone is gathered to understand and discuss and acknowledge this movement, sometimes from a discourse that is wholly from a whole of government approach to one that is a whole of society approach. Early intervention programs today is, while it has its earlier thrusts in terms of academic understanding, in terms of preventing crime or criminality, certainly today these early intervention programs means going out to reach out to different facets of the community, be it in terms of at the family level, social, education, where you're working with religiously inspired extremists or right-wing extremists. It refers to the engagement with all facets of the community. And in doing so, we recognize that through community engagement programs that governments and civil societies have continued to engage with, there is enhanced roles for family and community, where sometimes you see gender-sensitive national action plans, where you have activist approaches, the movement from having passive victims becoming active participants. So in some communities, what they have done is the victims approach. Someone asked this question of restorative justice, this element of having the victims come up to be voices against terrorism and exclusivism and extremism, and showcasing the devastation that it causes to the individual, to the community, to the families, and to the country as a collective. But the challenge, even as we look at these enhanced models, so while there are best practices that you would have often recognized from around the world, and certainly domestically that are present with civil society organizations, you also see this challenge of sometimes where international institutions, through goodwill, will have a lot of capacity building programs. But there is often this danger that we always warn against in terms of community engagement programs that are present. Let me reshare it again. I think the slide went off. Just give me a second. So in this process of doing so, we recognize this importance of the whole of government approach. But today we see this movement towards having a whole of society approach, equally important as we discuss this role of community engagement, where you see this platform where governments and communities can work together, working with grassroots organizations, centers of excellence, or even educational institutions or religious organizations. So where does community engagement fit within this larger full spectrum response to terrorism? Certainly yesterday and perhaps the early parts of today, you would have heard about the efforts in terms of the broader threat remit. So the kinetic response of kill, catch, disrupt is one part of it. Certainly institutional frameworks, where you are talking about the work of national strategies or regional frameworks, are important. The third facet that is always important in dealing with terrorism is the reintegration strategies. And you would have heard about it in the rehabilitation or reintegration patterns of terrorist detainees that are there. Thereafter, you are looking at the role of community engagement, where supporting national and regional security and social cohesion initiatives are at the heart of having positive agents of disruption, where it is and will continue to involve the role of the intellectual space, where you're dealing with the policy part to explore, evaluate strategies, policies that are undertaken. What Dr. Malkanti referred to as the role of practice, the praxis part of it, where theory will meet practice at its heart, and melding that together through an appreciated sense of belonging to the community is important, especially in dealing with communities where you try and build resilient networks. The effectiveness of the agent of change, the community as a whole, comes with positive elements, but at the same time, we recognize that there are certain hurdles that we need to overcome. Where communities are agents of positive change, you are sometimes faced and confronted with the challenge of a lack of coordination at times, or a lack of expertise in preventing violent extremism. You have varying levels of capability building, and sometimes where capacity building and training are made available, repetitive training or limited coordination or lack of consultation with donor or country representatives become an important impediment to overcome ultimately. But by and large, preventing violent extremism strategies with goals that are specific, with goals that are measurable, understanding the multidisciplinary platforms that it's present in, the fact that we acknowledge that it has to be achievable despite the fact that we have multiple agencies, having processes that are relevant, outcome-driven, and that are time-bound and are not coercive, because we're dealing with engagement with the communities and dealing with building trust in order to inspire a sense of resilience. So while we are confronted with either resource management or the challenges of sometimes a non-conducive environment, we acknowledge the need and necessity to invest in community engagement strategies, be it working with the schools, working with community organizations, in order to work within that remit of prevention. The question is it an art or a science? Be it in terms of activities that are present, often in enough art or science, sometimes I say it's a choice. While diversity in communities need not divide, the art of cohesion or the art of working in community engagement is sometimes born out of a conscious choice. The art lies in the strength, in harnessing the strength in diversity, trying to nurture and sustain a level of cohesion and nurture and sustain efforts at preventing violent extremism. So in conclusion, while we think about these broad strategies and how community engagement, in order to work towards preventing and working with communities at all facets, involves having an attitude of vigilance within the community, certainly building that resilience, which is ever so important. States talk about community resilience. Businesses talk about business continuity. Ultimately, it's about the ability to respond to an attack and for the communities to remain intact and together, to prevent, and in the unfortunate event that an attack takes place, to rise up above that challenge. And in doing so, understanding the evolving strategies that terrorist groups are using in order to evolve these strategies in engagement as well. In facing the next wave of terrorism, certainly it is this resolve to be resilient. All of this must be built on the foundations of communities of trust. And while we think about elements of these communities coming together, onus also lies on leadership to sometimes spearhead these efforts moving forward. The scale of success sometimes is dependent on choice, the choice of individual members of the community to make towards this greater goal of working in community engagement and building a more inclusive and cohesive society to both prevent individuals from going down the path of radicalization, but at the same time, having a spin-off effect of having a more resilient and engaged community, a more resilient and cohesive community. So in an environment that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, we acknowledge the need for leaders with understanding, vision, understanding, clarity, and agility to navigate this next wave. Preventing violent extremism, these community engagement strategies need to be engaging, need to be dynamic. It needs to consistently be generative and enduring. It is not a one-time off engagement strategy. It's one that will continue and remain part of the hallmarks of larger counterterrorism and countering extremism strategies ahead. And with that, I thank you for this quick presentation. Let me now stop sharing, and then I'll pass the floor over to the esteemed moderator.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Jolene, for your fruitful presentation. Now I will take part to ask a few questions from my side. In general, to what extent you think the fight against extremism and terrorism have been effective to this day in global level?
So I think this question of success or effectiveness, so there's measuring success is often a monumental challenge, right? When you think about it that way, where you are faced with this challenge of ongoing radicalization. We acknowledge global complexities. By and large, where we have seen success is in terms of efforts by government and state organizations to shore up counterterrorism capacity. So whilst we look at a decline in the number of attacks globally, we also have to navigate some of these questions of success of reduced number of attacks with the current climate of a pandemic, with the shoring up of counterterrorism, counterintelligence efforts on the ground. So there is good work by national and state agencies to mitigate the threat. But at the same time, you also see an ongoing challenge of recruitment, radicalization, and even how terrorists and extremists have been capitalizing today in an environment where we're all online through online radicalization, the use of gamification software, and various platforms. So we have seen success in some areas. The numeric quantum is something that I always hedge against trying to navigate and calibrate perhaps levels of success in. So we have seen successes in terms of maybe if we think reduced number of attacks, that's one. But we acknowledge that there are certain other mitigating factors that have seen a reduction in these numbers of attacks as well. And this includes the good work of the services, current climates that we see here with ongoing pandemics that prevent travel. But we acknowledge that there are interdicted plots. We acknowledge that there have been numerous efforts by agencies to prevent radicalization on the ground. So it's a mix. So certain aspects have seen significant leaps and bounds in terms of strategies of, say, working with communities, these best practices that we've gleaned along the way, and toolkits that have been made available that you can then take to various communities as well. So there are certain best practices and successes.
Do you differ the successes regarding to the region and the landscape and the community? For instance, we have seen in this last decade, especially in Middle East, we have this rise of terrorism after the eruption of the Arab Spring, for instance. I mean, do you see the difference in one region? There is rise on terroristic activities and extremism in other regions as well in Arabic world, because I think there is not necessarily, if there is extremism, there should be terrorism as well. For example, in Egypt, sometimes we see extremism by a Muslim Brotherhood, and sometimes we see act of violence. And how you evaluate this in South Asia or in Southeast Asia when we are not seeing very much radicalization, but there is rise in Middle East on a regional level. How you can explain us this shift in radicalization and group activities?
So in terms of trying to underscore these core difference, right, as you think about it, certainly when you're saying how do you see an increase in the number of radicalization as a process, as you would well acknowledge as well, we only see the manifestation later on. The process of radicalization is very inward to an individual, whether or not an individual engages with a group or is radicalized online. But we see its manifestation sometimes in online chatter, its manifestation in terms of ongoing research that we're doing, looking at some of these online chatter and extremist propaganda and these materials and discussions that are sometimes placed online. So we're looking at various facets. Certainly, as you rightfully pointed out, there are ebbs and flows. So whilst we see, for example, with the takeover of the Taliban in Afghanistan, while we have seen within Southeast Asia, for example, groups that have started to pledge allegiance to extol the values of the Taliban, or in this case, try to hedge themselves closer. Certainly within Southeast Asia, we have seen groups that historically have gone and traveled to Afghanistan to fight in the Soviet-Afghan occupation in 79 to 89. And many of them who have either been incarcerated or are released post having served their period of incarceration or time, certainly then hedge towards global issues. So they hedge towards understanding in terms of looking at the global environment. As you said, there are ebbs and flows. We have seen heightened radicalization. We have seen heightened extremism in communities. And these, given the transnational, trans-border nature of terrorism, its manifestations online, and how, so long as you, as a threat that is transnational. So while there are areas of operations, while you would see threats and attacks and groups manifesting on the ground in countries and groups and individual countries' areas of operation, geographic territorially. But we also see these manifestations online. So long as, for example, material is posted, and when materials are posted in languages, language is not limited to territorial areas. So long I can read Arabic, I can read whatever is happening there. If I can read Bahasa Indonesia, likewise, I can attune to the propaganda material that are either in Bahasa or being translated from Arabic to Indonesian, for example. Likewise, if you're seeing material in Hindi, Urdu, Pashto, or Dari. So we have seen this where this transformative power technology is concerned. That has certainly transformed the environment. So while you're looking at it as areas of operation territorially, a lot of these activities that take place online have more transnational manifestations later on.
Regarding the community engagement, how essential you see next to operational tactics on the ground in fighting terrorism? And in general, what methods should we implement? You presented it in the presentation, but on the ground and more practically, you think how effective it could be next to the operational tactics, or even if it can be more effective than operational tactics, because sometimes we have seen that the operational tactics are not successful. We have seen that especially in Iraq. But for instance, previously, as you have mentioned, in Afghanistan, community engagement somehow have been more successful. So how you can explain these two incidents?
So I think when we're thinking about tactical elements, the kill, catch, disrupt cells and organizations, those are like when a terrorist group is, when a plot is interdicted or a terrorist group is caught, or a leader, decapitation of terrorist leadership. So you kill, catch, you disrupt the cell, you arrest the individuals, the cadre or the leader, for example. All of them are very tangible, and rightfully so, right? So you can, organizations, or be it in terms of press reports, you're able to note and notify. It's very tangible, numeric, when you're talking about number of attack plots that have been interdicted, or efforts to isolate, contain, or mitigate the threat through operational strategies. So some of which you can count, some of which, if the intelligence services are working on them, then maybe if they're not reported, but certainly from the remit of government, they can count and try to understand the scale of the threat. The role of community engagement, I would see it as a more, it's a more long-term strategy, right? So if you're thinking about interdicting a plot, if there is an imminent attack, that's a short-term strategy. You need to interdict the plot in order to prevent the attack. So the length of space and time is quite limited, right? So in this case, if it's an attack, if you're interdicting a plot or a group or individuals, so those are, so it ticks the numeric box, the number. It ticks the box of trying to navigate it within a spatial time continuum. But when dealing with community engagement, I suppose here is where the challenge would be in trying to assess whether or not we acknowledge its importance. Community engagement is an important facet to deal with prevention. Here in this case, it means educating and working with youth. Sometimes it means going out to the community. So it means going out and doing a lot of programs or engagement strategies, so that if a member of the community maybe knows of on an individual on a path of radicalization, be it their friends or members or within schools, within various subsections of the community, it's about reaching out, ensuring that the community maybe has somewhere to call, they know who to ask information from, they know who to tap on to receive rightful information, and so there's no misinformation in the process. And in the process of seeking information, they don't go to the wrong sources at the same time. So these strategies put in place is long-term. So certainly you are aiming for prevention, where groups and individuals that one engages with, you prevent them from even going down that path of radicalization. Hopefully they don't become a number or an interdicted plot, or become a threat of attack. But at the same time, it yields a more broader, it manifests a broader good in terms of, in the event, so while that one act of trying to engage with members of the community, be it in terms of public education, or in that same breath, when most of these engagement sessions are conducted, it also builds community linkages. So while it prevents individuals, or it helps individuals in the community identify factors and facets of radicalization, in the unfortunate event of an act of terrorism, where it may tear at the social fabrics of society, then the society has already put in place a social net in that case, through engagement patterns, through community leaders, through leadership, who would be able to then steer and guide the communities away from tearing at its social fabric. So yeah, I suppose that would be my response. It yields a long response.
That's interesting. Informing the content and the ideology, or the model, if you want to say, is it for specified community, or it can be an ideology or set of rules or agenda for different parts of the world? Why I'm mentioning this? Because we know very well that the issue is not only in religion. For instance, now if you are talking about radical Islamic groups, okay, they are using some fatwas or some rules taken from the Quran, or sometimes it's biased, but the culture in Middle East is totally different from the culture in Southeast Asia. I mean, you cannot put the Arab and the Indonesian in the same basket, although they have the same religion, or they are using the religion to act in a terroristic actions, but their culture, their landscape, their language is totally different. So you think the ideology and the plan that you and the other experts are setting for community engagement, it can be fits for all, or we have to take close action to the region, as I have mentioned?
I think this question of, is there a one-size-fits-all strategy?
Exactly.
Is there a one-size-fits-all that fits, say, the Middle East or Southeast Asia or South Asia? Unfortunately, I think there is no one-size-fits-all. And the word, I mean, we acknowledge that all our communities are different. Community in Middle East, community in South Asia, community in Southeast Asia, community in Central Asia. Community at its heart is different amongst all our regions. As such, engagement strategies would also have to differ. It would have to.
But the terrorism is same. It has one language.
So the act of violence has one language, and terrorism has one language, certainly. But and in the process of engaging with communities across, so all our communities tend to be very diverse. But as terrorism has, as you say, one language, but I think there are also shared human values that we can all underscore as part of these community engagement patterns. These general human values of the want to live in an inclusive society, the want to be socially cohesive, the want to deal with more humanitarian values, all of which underscore a lot of the effort. So it's not just about engaging with ideology alone, right? So if you want to have a community engagement program that deals with maybe just prevention or just engage, so there are many types of community engagement programs. Some programs are structured with that niche element of maybe engaging with the community, engaging with ideology. But by and large, community engagement programs will have to pull in, be it in terms of national values, they will pull in humanitarian values, they will pull in shared values. So there is an element in that structure where it can be a best practice for all, but within each community, as you rightfully acknowledge, or in a more subtle way, there are differences between these communities, and each community, in trying to push forth and put out these engagement programs will have to chart their own way, right? So we understand that there's a best practice, we want social cohesion, but the pathway that each community is going to take or the strategy is taken to achieve that same end may be slightly different. It may differ with the culture, it may differ with faith, it may differ with identities of those that are involved, or even the capacities of those that are involved, especially these civil society organizations, if they are at the heart of these community engagement efforts.
In terms of ideology, because we are academics, you think, is it possible to create an ideology based on tolerance and the notion of coexistence, which will be contradictory totally to the ideology of radicalization? Because we know very well that the core base of terrorism and extremism is based on ideology. The pillars are based on ideology. So I believe that even if we try the community engagement and the civil society involvement and everything you have presented, but can we put all these points based on an ideology, academically well studied and revealed and invented? Is it possible?
I think in terms, okay, if we take ideology to be a loose construct, right, as a belief system, are there common beliefs that as a community we all share? As a global community, do we all share? So those are elements that I suppose we can pick out to maybe put in place for this foundation, for creating a network of a shared foundation of values or humanistic values, if you would call it that way, that would deal with creating that notion of a belief system. It's very ideal, it's very idealistic, but I think that there are at its base certain human values that everyone ascribes to. You know, the values of peace, tolerance, something that even if you asked an extremist out there, they may not want to be peaceful to you, but they acknowledge they also want peace, right? They may not be peaceful to the, but they will acknowledge that you want peace. I remember, you know, whenever there's a hostage negotiation, we're always told that there are two means to negotiate. You either negotiate on position or you negotiate on intent or interest. The interest is what we will base on. We will base on the interest of commonalities, because that would be something that can help bind various strategies that are put together. But even with these strategies, like I said, even with these toolkits and best practices globally, we acknowledge the fact that there are pathways that countries will need to navigate in trying to build their own community engagement methodologies and patterns ahead.
Why I'm asking you this? Because I'm an idealistic person, so my question seems idealistic. Why I'm asking this question again, because we know in academic field there is the so-called term liberal Muslims or liberal Islam, if you would like to say. So I think they are on ideologic level, they are doing pretty much very effective work in terms of information and in terms of revealing the biased notions taken from Quran, which the radicalists believe that that is the true religion. For example, the Salafists and Takfiris. So I believe that in academia, this liberal Islam is doing very good job in terms of not only giving information to us, but giving information to the people that they live in that region and under that circumstances. We have one question. I will read it for you.
Sure.
Do you think global events like Rohingya problem, Palestine problem, Taliban revival, or other areas end up radicalizing Muslims in Sri Lanka?
In Sri Lanka?
Yes.
I'm not Sri Lankan. I would defer to Dr. Mal on that. But by and large,
Dr.
I think
Jolene, I'd just like to, I'll just like
Yes.
to, as I mean, it's not, sorry, I mean, I wrote it a little with a little flawed manner, but actually I meant that global events, do the global events end up radicalizing Muslim societies in a collective manner in respective, like individual countries, maybe in Singapore, maybe in Sri Lanka, like, you know. So, because what I want to say is that suppose locally, if there are no grievances, you know, okay, like, you know, community is talking to people, they're having a functional economic relationship with the other communities, like we have in Kerala. But then also we saw that, you know, a large number of young Muslim boys from Kerala went to join ISIS, you know. And frankly speaking, they didn't have any grievances, you know, as such, because they were rich people, they were well integrated in society, but it was purely for a religious cause. So, I mean, that was a response to an international event.
Yes.
So that's my question.
So I think, as you rightfully pointed out, you would also recognize the fact that even when you were thinking about the Easter Sunday attacks, they were quite well off as well. When you're thinking about the about what had happened in Marawi in southern Philippines, the group that was orchestrating that ultimately led to a 5-month siege in the city of Marawi by the terrorist group, the Islamic State, were also led by people who were ideologically driven, but they were also economically well off. So while we point to not having one single profile of a terrorist, international incidents and occurrences from all over the world, be it the Rohingyas, be it what's happening in Palestine, or what's happening in terms of in Afghanistan, for example, they will certainly resonate with communities around the world globally. And I think it speaks to globalization. It speaks to the fact that today we are holding this over WebEx, and we're all clocking in from different parts of the world, sharing a similar belief system or ideology, even if you want to think about it in terms of being idealistic, right? That want to do good or that want to make a change, be it in terms of these various hats that we wear, be it civil society, be it private sector, be it government sector, be it academia. It speaks to available platforms that continue to share narratives and ideology or belief systems, and it will continue to inspire groups or individuals on the ground. So yes, the quick answer to that is yes. But at the same time, we also acknowledge that where an individual sees poverty around the world or a global event of disaster, it doesn't mean that every individual gets radicalized. So you would have seen a cross-section of individuals, you know, being driven by ideology. Another cross-section may be driven by the economics of it. So in the early years, when IS had its physical territory in Iraq and Syria, one of the first calls that was made was a recruitment call in September 2014, calling and recruiting people, calling on teachers, calling on people who could deal with bureaucrats and civil society, you know, to build the foundations of society there as well. So where there were individuals that even responded to that call for economics, you know, they thought they'll be paid. Or even in terms of some of the recruits who were going from India, right? So they thought they'll be paid, but they went there, then they realized there was class and structure and hierarchy and decided, I don't want it there. You know, I don't want to be there, and they may have wanted to come back. Or the early images from the boys from Maharashtra who went there, for example. So you would have various facets, but international incidences will continue to resonate with individuals and pockets of communities, not only in India, I suppose in Southeast Asia as well. And that commonality is something where I think patterns and efforts at community engagement can try to educate and try to ultimately educate individuals and prevent them from going down this path of radicalization, going down that path of saying, I need to move to another country in order to make a difference, instead of, you know, you can make a positive difference through various platforms that may be available.
Thank you very much. Just one last
All
question
right.
that I have. Just one last question. Right? So you spoke about community engagement, and Ararat mentioned that there are a lot of cultural differences between the Middle Eastern societies and the South Asian societies. But we see that when the ideological ideologues and the leaders like belonging to some particular group like Salafis or Wahhabis, having allegiance to some high-profile cleric in Saudi or like some religious maktab in Saudi. Okay, when they try to spread the ideology in maybe in Kashmir or let's say in Bangladesh or even in Myanmar among the Rohingyas, it's the same uniform set of principles which they are spreading among the different Muslim societies, and that actually, kind of erodes the diversity part and creates a very uniform set of a radicalized society. Now, on one hand, we have this, band of religious leaders, which comes with the sanctity provided by a religious book and a religious institution. And they say that, well, I mean, we are credible people because we represent the true, authentic religion, Islam, and this is our message. So they are also engaging the community in a larger way. They are also engaging the community. They are spreading their ideology. They are engaging into welfare activities like what Jamaat-e-Islami does, like everywhere. They build orphanages. They try to provide education. They help in marriages. So they are also engaging the community. On the other hand, we have teams of scholars and civil society people. They are also trying to engage the community, but there is no religious X factor involved, the factor of the divine. So given, and certainly people belonging to a certain, especially in Islam, it's by default, it's something very natural to respond more effectively and enthusiastically to religion. So in that case, given that, how effective the community engagement policy would be, or having said that, I would say that have you ever what are the prospects of engaging imams or like religious leaders from the Muslim community in the community engagement?
Sure.
Or is it even possible?
No, I think it's possible. I mean, a quick answer to that is I think I know it's possible. And I think one of the key things that we see in terms of these community engagement efforts, and that's where I say that it differs country to country. So a quick example from back home here in Singapore, for example. So even as an academic working in private sector, would go out and engage with the community, sitting on my panel would also be a cleric. So we will engage. I've done sessions in the madrasas with clerics beside me. So we will engage as a group, engaging with the youth, engaging with youth leaders, engaging with the ulamas, your ustazas, your religious teachers and clerics. We have done community engagement efforts on a similar platform. On one panel, we will have multiple facets and have open discussion and dialogue. That is the only way forward, I think. So is it possible to do? Yes, it's possible. If in this case, in a given country or community, if you see that community engagement strategies do not involve the use of religious clerics. So if you need to, so in say, for example, if in your example, you spoke about Myanmar or Bangladesh for that matter. So in this case, having clerics who are moderate engage with other clerics to discuss these issues and ideas would be a viable strategy of engagement. I know here we have done it. I've done community engagement programs in religious institutions. We bring the clerics on board to secular institutions. So it's a multifaceted element of community engagement that would need to string together all these different facets. So don't ignore one. If the groups that you are trying to address are religiously inspired, then yes, you would need to have someone who's from the religious cleric on board to try and address these religious values or religious texts, for example, or to explain them further to the community. Legitimacy is important. So I would always have a religious cleric debate or discuss or explain the religious text, because coming from someone who is not from a particular faith, right? They wouldn't want someone who is not from the faith. You wouldn't want a Christian commenting on Buddhism, for example, right? If I can't go to a Buddhist temple and then claim debate on issues of Buddhism, for example. But certainly bringing, if the question and the challenge is from religiously inspired groups, then you bring on board a cleric. If it's from ethno-nationalist groups, then you bring on board individuals that can speak to these ideas as well and these narratives as well. And they are an important facet to include in the community engagement program, failing which, as you rightfully acknowledge, there will be a serious gap and a vacuum that radical and extremists would try to go into and fill that vacuum.
All
Thank you very
right.
much. Thank you. I think we can just wrap it up.
I believe we had very fruitful presentation. I would like to thank USANA's Foundation for organizing this great event. I would like to thank my guest, dear Dr. Jerard, and our participants to this session. I declare the session is ended.
Thank you very much, Ararat. I see
Welcome.
Dr. Malakanti has written something. Dr. Malakanti, you want to make some last comments?
Oh, yes. May I read?
Yeah, yes, definitely you can read. Yeah.
Yes, global events will impact on the region. No country or region is immune to the cancer of violent extremism. This is the very reason that regional cooperation is vital and strong governance. Eastern attacks point to the result of weak governance, and when national security is deprioritized.
Thank you very much. Makes sense. I mean, it's a very valid and a very perceptive understanding and the observation of the situation. Thank you very much. So once again, I would like to thank all the esteemed panelists, moderators, and our lovable audience today who joined us today and made this event, that is day 2 of Maharana Pratap Annual Security Dialogue, a big success. Thank you very much for joining us today. Tomorrow.